couldn't guess how long we beat them into the ground. It very well could have been several hours. Time stood still as a euphoric rage took over my body. I hacked limbs and torsos while marks splattered chests and skulls. Rips and maws tore into our flesh, spilling much of our blood, but we kept moving to stay on top and avoid a more seriously debilitating wound. We penetrated deep into their horde, slamming and slicing until they surrounded us from all directions, now thousands closing in slowly. Former humans and beasts of the forest alike, all manners of the dead were in motion again, working in unison. But we remained diligent, fighting back to back, their wall of death shredding against us like cheese on a grater. We fought in sync as one, evening the odds. A singular force of mindful punctuation against an innate blob of mindless weight. Strangely, I did not fire. This amazing weapon was weightless in my hands. My dismembering was only matched by Oberheim's bludgeoning. Together we spun and dug into the rotten wall that inched closer from all directions. Brains, blood, and all manner of guts turned the ground below into a deep crawling mud. Even though its residue lived on and made its way around our ankles and up our legs, it was slow and inept. We remained swift and slung it back to the heap as we continued the massacre. It seemed that this fight was not at all hopeless. Every moment of my life thus far, both good and bad, meant nothing compared to the joy I felt in that moment, as we killed the dead over and over again for hours on end. Ah, yes, this was living. Yes, this was living. However, the more of it we shed, the deeper we began to sink, and the further it crawled up our bodies. I began to struggle to keep my eyes and nose free from the splatter. In time, we were both knee-deep in strewn bone, muscle, and intestines, and soon enough we were struggling to remain mobile as this encroaching menace reached our waists. My euphoria quickly diminished as I realized that we weren't reducing this thing, only changing its ever-expanding shape. The more we killed, the more we sank. Bits of man and beast waded towards us, only to be struck down at the smaller bits. However, the dead remained vigilant. They continued to advance, not only inward from across the lake of gore, but also from below. It was as if all organic matter that had long since expired was reanimated and working in concert with the human death that crept forth that night. All of it, mindlessly connected, volition subdued, controlled by someone or something with one purpose: to make us part of it. It seemed only a moment later that my feet no longer rested on solid ground. The power of this monstrosity created a suction that attempted to draw me down. Either the earth had turned to slime, or so much of it had poured into the valley that I was now treading to stay afloat, struggling to hold onto my sword and becoming exhausted very quickly. My heart sank as I glanced to Mark and saw that he was suffering likewise. Our bonfire had long been smothered, leaving only the moonlight against the darkness. The stench of all that surrounded us was so pungent that it masked how it tasted. What was once a cacophony of moans and various mouth noises had turned into a guttural hum that vibrated throughout the valley as the gore trembled and spasmed, shaking the foundations of all around us. Overtop the rising and falling vibrations, I heard Mark cry out,
"He will consume us! We must seek higher ground!"
Somehow he managed to swing his hammer up overhead and pointed towards the tall barren rock outcropping that originally divided the valley's natural stream. This promontory was our only hope for survival. It took all of my strength to fight the suction of unanimous damnation. I pushed forward through the ebbing ossuary, keeping my face as clear as possible and using my sword to feel for the rock like a blind man with a cane. Random arms, legs, and heads pawed and prodded us. I slung bits of entrails and indistinguishable organs to the side. Before I knew it, I had totally lost sight of Oberheim. Finally, before complete desperation had taken control of my senses, I felt my sword tip strike solid rock. I pulled myself close and perilously pressed my body to the stone, digging my fingernails into a crevice. The top of the promontory was only several man-lengths above, meaning that the entire height of the valley was now under gore. I looked up to see Mark standing on a small ledge in the cliff. My strength was spent, but the sight of him offered a smattering of hope. I had no choice but to release my sword, letting it sink into the deep, and began to climb up the vertical rock. As I neared the top, Mark lowered his hammer. I grabbed onto the massive head with both hands, and again with remarkable vigor, the old man heaved me up and onto the ledge. The tide was still rising, even now reaching our feet. There was still higher ground to be had, so we continued to climb to where the promontory plateaued, slinging ourselves over the edge. The feeling of solid ground seemed foreign. As I slowly stood up, I wiped as much of the gore from my skin as I could, and I looked out over the valley. Now, a colorless shade of gray, the sea of death filled the valley and stretched as far as I could see. Bones of men mixed with the long rotting carcasses of animals heaved up from the depths of the earth, all sloshing back and forth, causing the trees high on the hillsides to the left and right to sway and fall. Further down the valley, I watched our windmills slowly slip and slide down the hillside amongst the trees. And for a moment, I noticed Mark's cabin, floating on the gray before it was crushed and sucked under. The thick, syrupy gore remained determined. Even the soil that filled the cracks throughout the rock on which we stood became alive, small but certainly bent on our destruction. More waves of gore crashed upon the promontory. The hum that it emitted raised in frequency each time a wave met the edge of our cliff, as if to express suffering impatience. With each wave, our circumstances became more dire. There was no way to escape the valley, and it was only a matter of time before we were subdued. I saw the gore levels rising quicker with each crash, its hum twisting into a sound more like a discordant scream that reverberated for miles. It was obvious that this event wasn't confined to murder. The whole of the earth was part of this nightmare, quite literally, this promontory, and all the living were sinking. The weight of the hopelessness that was upon us was crushing to my ethos. A violent chill hit my body, causing me to involuntarily vomit gobs of gore. The puddle of soupy blood at my feet immediately amalgamated with the stains in my clothing, and it began moving up my leg. I quickly shook it away and looked towards Oberheim for some sign of hope. He somberly raised his hammer, pointing towards a dim purple light emanating from a wide crack in the rocks, a short distance further along the plateau.
Korg Krumar, end him and end this madness!
And then, as if to punctuate the sentence, Oberheim dropped his hammer. He turned his back to me, stepped towards the edge of the cliff, and with a small casual hop, cast himself into the sea. No further words or explanation were offered. Immediately, a large crimson wave lashed out of the sea, seemingly to reach up and grab his body as it dropped. The wave let out an orgasmic scream of agony and ecstasy as it engulfed him, pulling his body to the depths of the deluge. In an instant, this stranger who I knew so well was gone. My only chance for an explanation to all this, my only hope for survival. I rushed to the edge, reaching down into the gore, desperately grabbing for something solid. Instead, the gore grabbed me and nearly pulled me in head first. I jerked back and scurried away from the edge. There was no saving him, and even if I could, I knew it would be wrong. He got me this far, and for that I was grateful. What hurt more than the loss of perhaps my only friend ever were the unanswered questions that swarmed in my head. I still didn't know who Oberheim was, what was underground, why he chose me, or what had transpired in the last 24 hours defying the laws of science as we understood them. I forced myself to shrug off the strange comfort that this contemplation provided. Time was running out. The promontory was no longer a safe haven as the tide brought red antipathy both over the edge as well as through the small crevices of the promontory itself. I looked towards the opening in the rocks ahead. The purple light glowed brighter, pulsating, beckoning me to investigate. Utterly exhausted, I crawled towards Oberheim's hammer. As my arms struggled to support the weight of my chest, I realized that my body was involuntarily shivering. Another surge of vomit made its way up and out, blending with the gore that I pressed through. I shuddered at the thought of how much more was inside me. Eventually, my shaky hand reached forward and grasped the handle of the gigantic hammer. Using it as a crutch, I forced myself upright. I mustered whatever strength I had left, expecting great difficulty in lifting the hammer. Instead, similar to my sword, it was extraordinarily light. As I raised the head up and over my shoulder, I felt my vitality begin to return. My nerves settled, and all of my muscles began to feel unnaturally stronger. Again, so many questions to ponder, but so little time to do so. I was now knee-deep in gore. Quickly but cautiously, I approached the narrow opening, a vertical crevice just barely wide enough to squeeze through. Purple light poured out from within the cave. He was in the center of a large round chamber, in an upright standing position, but levitating an arm's length above the ground. His bare feet hung lifelessly, toes pointed down, seemingly to balance his body as it rotated at a medium pace with the poise of a dancer. The purple light that filled the chamber seemed to emit from under his body, like the intangible exhaust from a rocket. His hands were pressed tightly together in a meditative praying position. Everything fell silent, including the atonal shrieks of death outside. Although he was humanoid in shape, he lacked many commonly distinguishable features. His unnaturally smooth skin was pure black and oily in appearance. There was no sign of hair anywhere on his head or body. His tattered gray robe hung loosely over his emaciated frame, a hood covering much of his nearly non-existent face. I could not locate a mouth or nose, although there was a ridge across his forehead in the place of eyes. Either he was sightless, or his eyes were so tightly shut in woeful concentration that they disappeared in his somewhat egg-shaped skull. This being was Korg Krumar. His insect-like frame expressed a deep-seated spitefulness, not only by its external characteristics, but because of how the sharp bony edges were held with poetry and tact. I sensed nothing but torture and hatred from him. He was suffering, and while I assumed him to be dangerous, I felt no threat in approaching him. I stepped closer, lowering Oberheim's hammer as I neared this floating marvel of destitution. At first, I considered speaking to him in the hopes of procuring an explanation, but doing so would require cowering, sacrificing myself to a being that wielded great power through his own self-sacrifice. Krumar showed no sign of fear and remained expressionless. As I neared him, the flame under his feet slowly dissipated, and his body gradually lowered to the floor, leaving the cave nearly dark except for the faint blue of the moon that shone through the narrow opening. His bony hands relaxed and slowly drifted to his sides. Perhaps it was the effect of time standing still, or the silencing of the calamity outside, but I actually began to consider reaching out and embracing his brittle frame. What use would a hammer be against such a harmless creature? And was there not some justification for his hatred? I mean, again, he was suffering. Shouldn't kindness be considered? My indecision quickly mutated into an oppressive weight of self-loathing. After everything I've seen and survived, and all I've killed, why now, when a conclusion can so easily be had, why would I doubt my own self in the face of this pathetic creature? He dropped to his knees in front of me, arms outstretched, palms up, and cocked his head back, his expressionless face pointing to the ceiling of the cave in complete and utter helplessness. Krumar wasn't begging for his life. This prostration was a sincere plea for destruction. This was the one that controlled it all, who had quite literally destroyed the world, after bidding all of creation to devour itself, becoming the animated digestion of the living, turning solid into sludge and order into tumult. Why now would such a nefarious creature beg for a selfless ending? Would destruction by my hand bring him undeserved satisfaction? My momentary deliberation seemed endless, until I decided. It didn't matter what he wanted. My satisfaction and the actions that would bring me joy were all that I lived and killed for this night. Let him invest in his rotten altruistic destruction all he wanted, or wanted not. Whatever the contradiction may be, it does not live on after he ceases. It would end now with Oberheim's hammer, a weapon of unquestionable veracity, made for one unmistakable purpose. With body reborn and conviction reawakened, I raised the mighty hammer high above my head, standing strong and tall above the meek, faceless wretch below. I took note of the satiating silence around me as I let the hammer drop cleanly onto Krumar's skull, his entire frame folded under the righteous weight, collapsing and disintegrating as if it were made of burnt paper. The hammer shook the floor of the cave and echoed a thunderous resound. Echoed a thunderous resound. Echoed a thunderous resound. Echoed a thunderous resound. And echoed a thunderous resound. All that was Korg Krumar was gone in an instant, leaving nothing behind but a small amount of fine black dirt and something resembling a hardened seed. I swept it aside with my foot, rested my hammer on my shoulder, and walked outside towards the now rising sun.